Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are going to give people a couple of more minutes to join, and then we will kick things off. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on managing the new insider threat risk in the education sector and beyond, which, of course, is a very relevant topic as we wrap up the year, where many tried to balance this evolution of the education sector as we know it over the last 2 years, especially coming out of the pandemic with the rise of remote learning and everything in between. So we'll dig into this conversation. Before we do, just a quick intro on background. So I'm your speaker for today. I'm Dr. Christine Swakor. Background on me, I've worked in the cybersecurity industry for over a decade. I led a variety of different cybersecurity functions in the Fortune 100 space before taking on my current role as the founder and CEO of Cyber Pop-Up, which is an on-demand cybersecurity services platform. I also earned a PhD in security engineering, have served as a graduate cybersecurity professor as well, and so tons of expertise in the academic side as well. And so this topic, of course, is something that is a little bit closer to me as well, because I've really lived and breathed some of these challenges throughout my career in the academic space as well, both as a student and as a professor. We'll also have Suzanne Parent from the Veriato team as well come on later on to share some more updates and insights into how their technology can help as well. So she'll be joining also. Now, for today's topic, like I said, super relevant right now. Remote learning is an inevitable reality for academic institutions. Even before the pandemic, right, remote learning was on the rise, but this era has made the trend even bigger. More dominant across institutions, and most notably amongst public schools. Now, these institutions are investing heavily in sort of the ed tech or educational technology space, right? But investments in the cyber defenses tend to lag due to whether it's budget constraints or oftentimes just a lack of awareness of what the gaps are until something really bad happens. Whatever the case may be, there has to be greater attention to cybersecurity in this space, because as remote learning or hybrids, which we're seeing a lot, become that sort of new normal, unless we invest in addressing some of the challenges and the threats and things that I'm going to share more about today, this gap continues to widen. Um, Adding to that challenge is that when you think about the different types of users that exist in a space, from students to teachers to parents. It just adds complexity to the mix. And so for today's agenda, we're going to dig into that a lot more. So we'll start with some of the recent trends that are emerging in modern education environments. We'll talk about real world attacks against education institutions. I'll walk through a couple of examples of those. We'll talk about how attackers are leveraging advanced methods in everything from social engineering and beyond against students, parents, faculty, and more. And then we'll talk about tips for managing these insider threats in the education sector and beyond. A lot of these tips, I'll point out, while we're focusing on the education sector today, can be applicable to tons of different industries. So no matter what industry you're kind of focusing on or joining us from, this is definitely relevant information, and you'll walk away with, I think, some good takeaways there. You also get a chance to see how you can leverage real technology to reduce these risks from Suzanne. Now, the last thing I'll mention before I jump right in is, of course, feel free to ask any questions that you have in the question box. I'll keep an eye on those throughout the session, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. So yes, please feel free to, at any point, if you have questions, pop that into the chat area. Now, jumping right into trends, I want to start with a few that I think really set the context for this. So one, and honestly, some of this really gets under my skin, because I think that targeting, of course, like targeting any organization is like a bad thing, but I feel like people are here, kids are here to learn, students are here to learn, and so why mess that up? But unfortunately, it's something that attackers do, because they know it's a space that, when impacted, can have dire consequences, which means people are more willing to pay up and things like that. And so this first, that 19% increase in cyber attacks targeting K through 12 schools between 2019 and 2020. So these cyber attackers are really increasing their targeting towards these institutions for a variety of reasons that I'll get into in a second, but that's not going to go away. So cyber incidents involving education institutions are expected to jump 86% this year. So we saw that 19% in the prior years, 86% this year. And that is, I believe, a direct result of the growing introduction of remote learning and hybrid environments that are coming up. Because, like, we have to remember that while most students have kind of gone back to on-site learning and things like that, if you look at the bigger picture in the grander scheme of things, there's a lot more just e-learning programs that have been developed coming out of this, like investments and growth in companies who are really focusing on building e-learning platforms has just skyrocketed. And so as a result of that, I think we'll continue to see this jump over time. Another alarming one: schools, universities, and research facilities average 1,700 plus attacks per week. And that number can even be much higher, right? So if you look globally, there's areas that are just experiencing it way more. For example, in India and Italy, the average is actually over 5,000. Like those areas are getting targeted a lot more. Israel, I think, came in third at a bit over 4,000. And so I say that to say these attackers continue to be ruthless in their focus on this space. Another one is that 40% of these attacks involve some kind of data leak. And so when you think about the fact that a lot of these institutions house the data of everything from minors to all of the different roles that are involved in the education sector, to, in some cases, it could be private research, right? Or data or insights that could be intellectual property. And so there's all these different data types and angles to think about when you think about a data leak that can happen in the education sector, and what can happen with that. Everything from, competitive research getting into the hands of like a competitive nation state or anything like that, all the way to identity theft with student data being leaked. And so yeah, a good portion of these attacks involve that data leak, which is important to note. And then another one, we talk a lot about ransomware, because that's something that just for the industry as a whole continues to grow. But in the education space, we've seen some special attention here. So 12% of attacks against education systems were powered by ransomware. And so this is definitely an area to pay attention to as well. Now, I want to get into how these sort of user-based or insider threats show up in education environments. There are a couple of different ways. I'll start with ransomware because that's what I was on before with that last stat. Again, 12% of attacks involve some kind of ransomware. So since the pandemic, these cyber criminals, of course, are leveraging new attack vectors, everything from phishing, ransomware, malware, all of these things to target the remote learning sector. On the ransomware front, where, as I'm sure you all are aware, but just at a high level, right, it's these attackers who they tend to either send like some kind of like phishing email, let's say it's directed to a student or directed to a faculty. They click on that. It ends up being malicious. It ends up, opening up ransomware. Let's say it connects, if the student is on the network, right, or connected to different systems, it can spread. And then you have an entire issue, which is what we've seen in the past. These attacks can essentially halt the operation of the institution, right? And halt the ability for students to attend class and to learn and for teachers to teach and so on. And so I think attackers are seeing that the stakes are high, right? When you're shutting down an entire education institution and everything that comes with that. And so the likelihood that folks might pay the ransom could be a bit higher in their opinion. And so they're continuing to go after these types of organizations. Another one is the distributed denial of service attacks. So denial of service attack is basically when attackers try to send a bunch of fake data, or what we call dummy data, to a resource to overload it, so that it essentially crashes and can no longer operate. And so this is something that is still being seen in the education sector as well, where attackers are limiting teachers and students from being able to conduct remote learning in classrooms and things like that, because they're just overwhelming these systems, and the systems are now down. And so that's another one to pay attention to. Malware in general remains an issue. The most prevalent ones that we're seeing today are called Zeus and Slayer. So Zeus is a Trojan that has several variants that target Microsoft Windows operating systems, which is still a common operating system, especially in education institutions, versus, let's say, like Mac or others. You still see a ton of Windows systems. And so you see a lot of malware attacks that are geared towards that. And so um, with the other one, Slayer, so this is a downloader that is used for Mac as well. So I had mentioned Microsoft before, but that's not to say that like they're the only ones getting targeted, right? Yeah, Slayer focuses more on the Mac OS side, and produces malicious ads for products like Adobe, Flash Updater, different malicious websites, and so on. So those are a couple of trends there. A couple of other ones that I want to touch on. I think one of the ones that we've probably seen the most in, social media and press and everything in between are video conference disruptions, right? So they called it quote unquote Zoom bombing, where, folks are trying to, learn and teach in class, of course, and all of a sudden you have some random disruption that comes into play where they're either I don't know. There's been a ton of different sort of reactions there, whether it's harassing students and teachers or displaying violent images or just being silly or like whatever the intention is. There's been different motivations for these interruptions, but the point being, the same way that in a traditional school environment you would put measures in place to make sure that some random person couldn't, come into a classroom and start displaying random things, is the same way that you have to put those protection measures in place in a virtual environment as well. And so yeah, video conference disruptions are another one. And the other thing I'll point out is that those can come from, when you talk about insider threat, right? It's like those can come from within the organization. They can come from outside of the organization as well. And so it's important to kind of think through how you navigate both ends to that. Social engineering is huge, of course. So attackers routinely use social engineering against, everyone involved in the academic institution, students, parents, faculty, all of that to trick users into either clicking on phishing emails, to trick them into falling for fake voice calls, where they might be asking for certain information, or whatever channel is used, just really tricking people into disclosing information or taking actions that help the attacker carry out their attack. And I think the other thing to call out here is there's like generalized phishing where you're just kind of sending mass emails out to folks and hoping that somebody clicks. And then there's very targeted like spear phishing where you're really crafting something that's customized and targeting a person. And I think part of what's happening is as students get targeted, there's just so much more information that's available through social media profiles and through just like the massive online presence and data that's out there on students, especially, that it's a lot easier to craft very specific messaging and very specific spear phishing messages that are a lot more compelling or convincing for us students to click on. And so that social engineering piece is huge. Uh, Domain spoofing is another one. So this is where in order to take advantage of people who might inadvertently mistype a URL, or someone who might click a link that looks very similar to a familiar website, so instead of I don't know, nameuniversity.com, it's name university, but one I is missing, and it's like if you're not paying very close attention, you wouldn't necessarily catch that. And so that domain spoofing continues to be a problem in the education sector because, again, like this is a population that isn't typically aware of these types of risks and these types of attacks, especially when you're looking at some of the lower levels or earlier stages of education. And so those attacks just become way more effective um, in those cases. And the last thing I'll say on this is this, of course, is not the end. Like we expect to continue to see attackers just seek out new opportunities to continue to exploit this environment, especially as this continues to be the sort of norm. Now, I'm going to take a moment to just quickly walk through a couple of examples of this in practice, right? This isn't theory. These are real things that continue to happen. And so one example, and this one dates back to March of 2020. And I think this one is important to call out because it was just as the pandemic was, I don't know, starting to become a concern, and just before I think True Madness began. But in this case, through using social engineering tactics, that's how this sort of became a success. A hacker was able to compromise the Del Rio, Texas school district's computer systems, funds that were intended to cover the payment of 3 bonds that were issued from the district's comp controller were compromised and then transferred electronically to a fraudulent account. That was $2 million in funds to be exact. So not, small, nothing to be taken lightly, of course. And so that was a huge issue for them. Another one was a school district in Live Oak, Texas, Judson ISD, where they experienced a ransomware attack and had to pay over $500,000 to regain control of their systems and their networks. So another example, excuse me, um, another one. So in this case, an international malware group posted nearly 26,000 confidential files that contained student and staff information. Now, these files were stolen from the school servers. They were published online. But one of the interesting things to call out here is there's these sort of combo or like 2-hit attacks that are growing more in popularity, where an attacker will hit a company with ransomware and then say, hey, like, you need to pay this ransom to get access back to your systems. But oh, if you know don't have, or if you decide you don't want to pay and you decide you want to try to get through the get out of the incident through some other way, whether you have backups or something like that, they then threaten to leak your data to give you a greater incentive to, like, hey, I need to pay this because not only will I not have access to my files, but also they've already stolen my data and it's going to get linked online. And so, whereas before you had to worry about a pure sort of ransomware play where you just don't have access to your systems, now they're starting to do these combo attacks, which makes the stakes even greater. And so that's what happened in this case. They were actually hit with ransomware and told that they needed to pay 40 million to get access back to their system. But because they were not willing to do that, the hackers then leaked their files online. And so, so yeah, these attacks just continue to get more complex and, quite honestly, ruthless in nature. The last example that I'll go through is a ransomware attack that shut down Baltimore County schools for several days. Um, Now this one is a classic, ransomware attack as well. But I wanted to bring this one up because I think that there's so many different examples and so many different regions that are getting hit by these. Like, nowhere is safe. This Miami, Alabama, like, so many places have been hit with these attacks, and they're shutting down systems for days, sometimes, weeks. And it's like, when you're looking at the education sector, right? It's like, think of it from even from a parent's point of view or from a student's point of view, right? It's like, if we're here to learn and to, progress, and because of an attack things are shut down indefinitely, or, shut down for extended periods of time, it's just it's just unacceptable, not a good look at all. And so, so yeah, these things can disrupt learning for extended amounts of time, and so it's super important to pay attention to. The other dynamic that I'll add to this is these attacks continue to rise, in part also because there's this growing attack surface due to remote work, right? So every student device, every faculty device, all of these things become attack points, or entry points for attackers to get into network. And then when you couple that with the low cost to execute some of these attacks. You can buy a ransomware kit on the dark web for as low as $100, right? And the level of complexity can vary based on what you're willing to invest. But when you're spending that low of an amount to launch an attack where you can demand 40 million in ransom for a school, or demand some of these higher numbers, you can see how these attackers have the greater incentive and motivation to continue launching these attacks with hopes that they'll get a successful payment out of it. Now, I've listed a couple of names here, but I just want to touch on, who the insiders are, who are posing threats in the education sector and in academic institutions. And this is not to, excuse me, this is not to, point fingers or anything like that. It's really, it's best to get an understanding of who your users are, so you know how you can best protect them and protect the organization. And so when it comes to the education sector, of course, students and faculty are at the core of that, and everything from the devices that they work on to how they communicate with folks. All of these people in today's day and age have accounts and passwords, right? And so I think that when you talk about things like password hygiene, right, and a school might require that, like, hey, you have to have a password that meets a certain minimum requirement, right? But if you have a student who can't remember their password and is writing it down or whatever the case may be, it just opens up more risks. And so there's students play a role in this, faculty and staff. A lot of people tend to overlook this one, but parents as well. So as students, we're working remotely. As students, engage in e-learning, they're often using the devices of their parents, or their parents can control their devices or have some kind of access to it, depending on the stage of the learner. And so parents also play a role in this. Parents are often communicating with faculty and staff at the earlier stages of education. They're often communicating through email and things like that. And so when you look at phishing attacks and things like that, parents become just as relevant in some cases as the students and the faculty. You can't forget contractors, right? So like any typical business, academic institutions often have contractors who are working in everything from, it could be tech support to the cleaning team or maintenance team, and all of these folks, if they have any sort of email access, or if they have any sort of access to systems, can also play a role in posing threats to these organizations. And so lots of different layers to think about here. And I think this stat is a good example of that. Again, not pointing fingers and saying that any one group is the threat here, but in this case, for teachers specifically, when it comes to phishing, because that's a very popular vector still, right? 3% of teachers fall for phishing scams when on site, which 3% is, if you're looking at large numbers, like, sure, it could be considered a large quantity, but 3% is actually across the industry okay. However, when teaching from home or when teaching in remote settings, that jumps to 20%. And so I think that's such a huge indication of the added risk that comes with the new world that we now operate in, where there's this sort of mix of folks, engaging more in this online learning, and the sort of, I think, lax nature or the reduced attention to security that some users might take. And so, yeah, 3% on site, 20% off site, a huge difference. And I think something to keep in mind as we look at that difference between folks, the vigilance of folks on site versus off site. Now, getting more into what we can actually do about this. I want to touch on a couple of key challenges, and then yeah, I'll get into some tips on how we on a path forward. So there's a couple of different things at play here that I think make it challenging for educational institutions. The first is that um, and I've touched on this a little bit already, right? It's like there's more as these users connect even their own devices. Like I haven't even touched on BYOD, and based on the time we have here, can't too much. But based on the amount of users that we have in this evolving ecosystem, the threat landscape just continues to evolve, and so that skyrockets. I've touched on this already. Students and faculty oftentimes don't prioritize cyber hygiene, especially when they're outside of that school environment. When you get into the earlier stages of the educational institution, kids aren't necessarily aware of risk. We live in a day and age now where the earlier people know about cybersecurity risks and best practices, the better. And so that's a cultural evolution that I think needs to happen. Legacy systems are often still used in education. So this entire sort of shift to, remote learning and e-learning kind of came very rapidly for folks and didn't really give people a chance to prepare for that before having to take action. And so I think that plays into the challenge as well. Um, External attackers recruit insiders. So this is actually a super concerning one, in that you'll have attackers who will recruit at college campuses and recruit at some of these places where students are very impressionable and can be influenced. And so yeah, that's another challenge to consider. Um, and then balancing trust with verification. I think especially in an academic environment, and this is the same with like the dynamic between employees and employers, in any case. But it's like being able to balance that, trust, with still saying that you have to verify, who people are and what actions they can take, because otherwise that can go south really quickly. Now, getting into a couple of tips here. So the first thing is, of course, like hardening remote learning technology. So applying all of the security best practices and things that we can do to secure, whether it's software applications. So I think we talked about video conference introductions, and so being able to harden your security settings to avoid those things from happening, all the way to like hardware considerations, everything in between. But the point is having a robust strategy for securing all of your remote learning technology. And then creating policies that address on-site and off-site learning become important as well, and making sure that all of the parties involved understand those policies and can comply with them, which ties into the next point. If you have policies and people are not aware of them, or if you have some of these recommendations and people just aren't aware of them, then they're worthless. And so having a robust training and awareness program that is truly customized to meet the needs of students, educators, and parents, I think that's huge, because when it's not enough to just share, I think, basic content on, have strong passwords and use, strong Wi-Fi. Like those things are important, yes, but I think it's also very important to tailor a lot of that messaging to really meet the needs and the level of understanding of the audience that you're talking about here, right? It's like when you're trying to educate students on cybersecurity awareness, right? That's going to be very different from how you educate your faculty and staff to a certain extent. And again, you don't want to leave parents out of that equation, because they can play a role in this also. A couple of other ones. So evaluating third-party security, especially in ed tech and other emerging solutions. So I've touched on this already. This is huge. People continue to invest in and buy more ed tech solutions, which is great. But just making sure that you understand the cybersecurity posture of those providers. How are they securing their product? How are they securing your data as a customer of theirs, and so on? Those are important questions to ask. Drawing key insights from data through user analytics. So similar to how in a corporate environment, you would monitor sort of user behavior and monitor activity for anything that's suspicious or for any anomalies, is the same way that in an environment where you're dealing with students and parents and faculty, you want to be able to manage that or get insight into that user behavior. And that can go a long way in giving insight into everything from insiders who might be, whether it's like someone who is disgruntled and is intentionally trying to do harm to, a very quick random story. But there was a post I saw on Instagram about a kid who learned how to like hack and take down the Wi-Fi of his entire school, and was able to do that. And so it's like these are, and it wasn't necessarily, I don't think it was coming from a malicious place. It was a curious kid trying to learn things. And so um, I think it's important to monitor that behavior so that you can sort of proactively manage some of that risk. Leveraging next generation threat detection and response tools can help with the automation side of things. Like you want to be able to automate this stuff as much as possible. And so I think that's another element to consider here. And then lastly, of course, is ransomware protection and support. So I had mentioned before, ransomware is one thing that continues to grow across several industries, but I think especially in the education sector. And these attacks can take entire schools, entire districts offline for days. And so having that robust ransomware program where you have your backups, but then you also have the other layers that are required to make sure that those backups are protected and don't get infected, right? And that you can detect ransomware very quickly and sort of segment your systems or cut off that attack from spreading. So yeah, just a couple of things. I know I've said a lot here. Hopefully that helps. If you have questions on any of this, of course, like feel free to drop those in the chat. But at this point, I think it's better to show you real options on how you can address some of these threats versus just walking through things in theory. And so want to welcome Suzanne Parent to the virtual stage here to walk us through some of the stuff that Veriauto has that can help out with this.
Thank you very much, Christine. I appreciate it. Yeah, just change to presenter and I will share my screen. Thank you. So some of the things that we want to talk about today is addressing the 2 points, or the 2 main points, which are looking at, of course, ransom safe. Christine closed with that in the last moments, and I will touch on that. I will also touch on how to prevent it, how to prevent the spread more specifically, and restore any of the encrypted files if a ransom safe has entered your environment. The second part I'll address and also show a demo of is how to track documents that might have been leaked, how to be aware if files are sent outside the organization, and be alerted when those occur. All the things that are potentially detrimental to having information being leaked out, and how to track different members of the organization I'll address in the cerebral part. So let me start with the ransom safe overview. So ransom safe, for some of you may say, well, I already have backups, or I already have an antivirus solution. Well, that's never just enough, because you're looking at the data that's being backed out, but how to restore it is never enough. The malware signatures that exist, they infiltrate your system through all the entry points that the students have access to. So what you really need to do is to try to find a way to do the remediation part of that and see how you can quickly put in place a solution that will protect you along the way and allow you to be alerted when there is a ransom safe or ransomware introduced into your environment. So specifically, and this is kind of a process where the installation is so quick, but yet you will save a lot of grief trying to return the data back to its normalcy, because we will set up alerts You can restore any files that were held, as they say, hostage. You can also protect, which means that when a ransom safe is detected, there are going to be alerts sent to you, and you can immediately lock out that user from infiltrating even further your file servers. With the backup capability, we call it backup, but it's really a safe. It's really the ability for us to keep every single file that's been changed throughout the moment before the intrusion of the ransomware, and quickly restore those files. So on a recovery path, after that attack has disrupted your environment, there's no panic. You can quickly get all those files recovered, literally in just-in-time recovery, because we don't use any of the backups. We have been saving all those files that have been changed prior to the ransomware being being committed. So how do we do that? A couple of ways. There are two ways. One that it's very, very important is to know all the ransomware attacks that are floating around across the networks. So we use a file screening capability. So we keep track of all the ransomware that's been that is known. We store those, we track those, and as soon as one is identified, we stop, lock, and block the user, and then alert the operator to do what they do, which is clean up each of the user's desktops and then restore all those files should any of the files have been encrypted. Of course, they come in very quickly. People build ransomware very fast. So what do? You need to make sure you have a alternate solution for those that you weren't able to collect or to store in our database. So we use a different technology called the honeypots, and that gives us the ability to strategically place those files across your file server. And if those files are attacked, again, we can detect that it was a ransomware attack, give you the ability to, through the failsafe, restore all those files and lock down the user. And it's that simple, and it from a protection point of view, you can easily be protected by giving you in 10 minutes immediately. In fact, after this webinar, you would be protected on all your files on your file server. And for the cost of each server, being the file server in education, Christine mentioned the ability for users to just use some of their tools or try different things and run different applications. So that's definitely something that will help you really prevent a lot of those ransomware destructions. So keeping that thought in mind, those students, and we're going to talk about how to really look at the solution of the data that we're collecting. So we looked at the ransomware, we looked at how to prevent, detect, and restore all those files. But now we're going to look at what's Cerebral, which is the solution that starts collecting the data of all those users, being students, faculty, external contractors, and so forth, to really look inside the environment and try to identify, is this an insider threat security issue? Is this a engagement, or are the students spending more time not doing their schoolwork, using the tools as they're supposed to? Or is this a compliance issue that the school has put out that they're not able to do a particular exportation of a file outside the network? So those are the three areas that we're going to address. And then at the end, I will show you very fast a little demo of the platform for Cerebral. Let me start with just giving you the picture. So the whole picture of the platform really covers everything. Now for the schools, some of the two things that are going to be very important is collecting all the information about the students and their behavior. So that's what we refer to as user activity monitoring, or UAM. All those activities are going to be collected, stored, analyzed, and alerted based on those conditions that meet your needs. In the meantime, we're also collecting what we refer to as behavior analytics. So the students' behavior, the faculty's behavior on their daily activities, and determine if it's something that is different from their previous period. And then finally, combining these two areas, so the user behavior, the user activity, combine those two using about 25 different variables to then predict a risk score and assess if that particular user is more prone to being needing an investigation, or if that student is doing activities that could open up breaches of data. If Christine talked about grants, research, anything that could potentially be a loss and confidential, you'll need to start looking at those. So this whole platform, it does use machine learning capabilities. It's got some AI-powered capabilities so that we're looking at the baseline versus the standard daily activities. Of course, schools are change all the time, so students move from class to class. Plus, you have the K through 12. You may have the university level school, so you have different needs. And of course, all the data that we collect, we have run tests through the Palo Alto Research Center, and we've tested against some of the high certain insider threat data sets, and have scored very high on that side. So all our algorithms are really intended to look at some of these activities that occur within the organization. Compliance. Compliance, of course, are all going to be different. We talk about students being remote, we talk about faculties being remote, we talk about schools being taught remote, and when everybody is accessing files all the time, and you're really losing access of where the file is. And so you need to understand, if you're going to get that data, if there's no communication left between the organization and the location of that user or student in this case. So if there is no communication that is direct with the school anymore, we continue to collect the data, and so you're never out of information. You're never out of the information that'll help you do the analytics. It continues to collect, and as soon as the connectivity is available, it'll send the data over to the school. We talked about the files. Files are all over the place in the organizations and the file servers. You want to track those files as well, because now you have more than one location to deal with. Before, you were in your organization. Now all these students that are remote and all the files that are important need to be tracked as well. So those are the things that will be able to give you information on where they are and who has actually moved them and what they did with them. Different devices exist that each student may have or faculty may have, and so we support monitoring the Macs, the PCs running Microsoft OS, of course, Windows terminal servers, and Android devices. We have, when you get all that data, it is sent to the server, then the server begins its analytical capabilities. What is it analyzing? All the data that we're collecting. So I'm just going to go over this real quick, but I'm going to point out those more important areas that Christine mentioned, which is around document tracking. So tracking all the documents, tracking all the file transfers, tracking all the websites they visit, all the applications they use, chats that might be detrimental. Now I want to talk about chats just a little bit more specifically in the school areas and in the K through 12. So the K through 12 has, in the last few years, provided devices to their students. The liability of the school remains the school's responsibility to make sure that the students are not in a inappropriate conversation, or they have access to locations that they shouldn't. Now, the devices that are being sent, whether they're using websites or email content, will give you that capability to create alerts based on those compliance and regulations that you believe are important within schools, and then set that up with the student or even just the parents directly to say, hey, you have a device and these are the sites that have been visited by your student. So these are agreements between the student and the parent that can be put in place for protection as well. Any Any devices that are used externally, whether it's printers or USBs or any cloud devices, would be considered an external exfiltration of data, whether it's that private or confidential documents that are sent out. So all this, again, all this information is collected and it's run through the analyzer, which is part of the machine learning to establish that baseline we talked about. Well, of course, that's a lot of data, and it's important to be able to know who has access to it. It's very confidential, so the ability to create access to the data on a role-based, on a feature base, and on event base is key to the security of that information. When you talk about risk scoring, we talked about it a little earlier on what makes up a risk score. That's the user behavior analytic capability and the activity monitoring capability. And each one of those will highlight where a user might be more prevalent more in the security breach using a color-coded approach. And then when you want to look into user, you'll see exactly what they're doing in the most recent alerts by user and dig in through that way. So the platform itself really does everything when it comes to watching the users, analyzing it, alerting you, and giving you the ability to see the data through one platform. And that platform can be viewed, including all the screenshots, should you choose to do that, and then to take an action, whether it's with a parent or it's with a faculty directly. All the data is captured, all the data is stored, and you can review it just like a DVR, essentially just using any kind of the tools that you may have when you create videos of family members, you do images. Well, it's the same thing. We actually give you the ability to review all those screenshots that were captured during the active time of every single user. And part of the ability is to export these screenshots. So if you're having a parent, a student uh, conference, you can, if they're choosing to, you can show them exactly what they've been up to and explain that these are not acceptable behaviors. So before I move on and and ask you to go see the demo, I want to show you the platform. And let me go to the platform right now. I believe that should be showing up right now. Are you seeing the platform?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, thank you very much, Christine. So I'm going to just go over real quick and give you some of the pieces of the platform, which makes it very simple for you to track. So the first thing is a policy, and we talked about policies based on faculty, could be students, could be external contractors. So you can see you can create various policies for each one of these groups. So here, for example, I created one while listening to Christine that the faculty and staff might be needing to have a different profile, being monitoring the data differently. So we just looked at all the data points that we're collecting, and it's as simple as changing those where we're looking at screenshots, we're looking at chats, we're looking at websites. So all this can be turned on or off by group, um, by policy in this case, and then identify who you want to record and when you want to record them. So each one of these has different settings. You can do email activities, collect the information from emails and understand if the documents are being moved and so forth. So that becomes the policy that each device will have based on their role in the organization, whether it's a faculty, staff, student, and different, even student grades, K through 12, you could easily break that down between the primary side and have a separate policy for them. Let me just show you real quick. So some of the things I was listening while Christine were talking was very important when you come to the students doing some deliberate or not intentional breach of tracking and looking at data or moving data. So we have about 100 plus dashboards already pre-ready for you. So when it comes to deployment and time to production is super fast because all the data is already ready for you. So if I look at an overview of document tracking, if I was looking at students, I could easily look at the students and exactly what kind of files they're moving and how they're moving them. And as quickly as I just click through this, I can actually see exactly which files. But this is when you're looking at something. But you can create alerts for each one of these as well, and then have reports that are flagging exactly what occurs on those alerts. Tracking to the cloud, so exfiltration out to the cloud if the cloud is not supported or if only specific cloud locations are allowed. You would look at the cloud capabilities. You've got email, so emails are always used, whether it's webmail or internal mail within the organization. School applications, so at the faculty level, who's using what application. So from a faculty point of view, they may be using specific office tools, Excel, and if that's what they need to do, or are they using other tools? So we literally track everything you need to know about the users and then what you need to do should you find that the excess or inappropriate access to information. Security overview, I'm going to talk very briefly about forensic tools. The reason I'm going to talk about this is because Christine mentioned a student who used some tools to try to break in somewhere. Well, some of these tools, there's a limited number of tools that exist, unless they write their own, of course. But you can start tracking any forensic tools that are being used and by whom and what they're doing with them. So those are other ways that you can start tracking. And then in the websites, so you want to know what websites the students are visiting. Of course, all of these websites are ranked by usage. You can be as specific or as generic as you want. You can include or exclude any one of these as part of your view or reports. Any of these dashboards have a matching report, but of course, if that's not enough, there's always a list of other reports. There's 80 reports already ready for you in the platform as well. There's a lot more, and I really encourage you to give us a quick call or send us an email to set up a demo for both of these products, because there's a lot more to cover, and the level of granularity that we have to protect your organization, your data, your research, and the students with our platform.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that overview and demo, Suzanne. I'm sure it was very helpful for many people to see you scratch the surface on what is a super valuable technology. So yeah, I've been keeping an eye on the chat and trying to answer as many questions through text as possible. Given I know we only have a minute left, so yeah, I just want to wrap up by saying, of course, these trends and this evolution of cyber threat within the education sector, something that we have to pay attention to, can't ignore, and hopefully some of the solutions that you've seen today around Cerebral and Ransom Safe give you some insight into how you can begin to manage those threats and more. So thanks, Suzanne, again for joining and for the amazing overview.
You're welcome.
Um, Thank you to all of our attendees for spending the last hour with us. If you have questions, again, reach out to sales@veriato.com. Until then, enjoy the rest of your weeks and have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you again, everyone.